You're now live.
Okay, we are live. This is Senate Finance. This is the 28th of April. And I'm bringing up my, okay. Jim Demaray is here to talk to us about the yield bill. And Jim, there were two sections that we didn't go over yesterday because I believe it was Becky said it was yours and she wasn't going to go through those. So the floor is yours. I'm bringing up my documents from yesterday.
Do you want me to bring this up on the screen?
That would probably be helpful. Yep.
Okay, so let me grab
That
that.
would be easier than
I'm going to
my
turn my
way.
camera because my bandwidth is low, so you won't see me. But
that's
okay.
fine.
Here is okay. So here it is for the record. First of all, Jim Damery, let's console. Just walking through two sections of the yield bill as it's before you. The first is section 3, and this deals with how equalized peoples are determined. And it puts back into place what was here a few years back, which is a 3.5% hold harmless provision. So the language is here, which reads, for the purposes of determining weighted membership under this section, a district's equalized people shall in no case be less than 96.5% of the actual number of equalized peoples in the district in the previous year prior to making any adjustment under this section. So basically protection for school districts from higher tax rates due to declining enrollment, and the protection is up to 3.5% basically of the prior year's numbers.
Okay, so this is more of a, we've done it with a lot of things to prevent tax rate shock. Perhaps if a company gets moved out of town and it suddenly drops off. Refresh my memory, Jim, is this how we got in trouble with ghost students?
Well, it was, but that version of this had the 3.5% compounding over year.
Okay.
So you ended up with ghost students, which were some districts had like 10 or 12% hold harmless. But this is written, I checked this with AOE, to be a pure 3.5%. So by simple example, if you have 100 students in year 1, you lose 10 in year 2, so you'd be at 90. This would place your count at 97.5 for that second year.
Okay, so you're going, so we've protected you the first year. If you see but let's see, you went down to 90, so you lost 10 students, so you've got 97. But the next year, how many students do you have? Do we keep ramping it down?
No. So you compare just 1 year to the previous year. So again, if you have 100 students, you lose 10, normally you'd be at 90. But this protects you and says, no, your count for the second year won't be 90. It's going to be what, 96.5.
90, all right, 97, all
Right,
right.
yeah.
But we've got 3 or 4 ghost students in there. And
Yeah,
and the next year, do I ramp down to get rid of those ghost students, or do they stay there? And what if I lose another 10 the year after?
My understanding talking to AOE is that in year 2, you're at 90. You got a benefit. You're counted as having 96.5, but you actually had 90. In year 3, you'd be comparing your 3 number to 90 the previous year, not that not the 96.5. So in other words, it won't compound because you're actually using the actual number from the previous year, not the hold harmless number from the previous year.
Okay, so when I go to year 3, I'm using 90 as, but I'm still getting sticker shock there.
Yeah, well, you still got a problem, correct? But at least the ghost students won't,
Just one
under
year.
this, won't compound like it did before.
Okay, Mark's got his hand up. Mark, can you?
I just want to point out that for the vast majority of districts, this is current law. This provision would extend this to districts that were required to merge under Act 46. So it's pretty much existing law. It just extends it to those communities that the board ordered to merge. That provision was taken away from them back when Act 46 was passed.
Yeah, so for voluntary mergers, this was done for those voluntary mergers. For districts that did not merge or were forced to merge, this would apply to them, give them that same benefit.
Okay. Any impact on the ed fund? There would be, right?
No, there's actually no impact overall on the education fund, but it just is a slight change in who pays. Because what it does is it changes your per pupil spending. But we have to raise the same amount of money regardless of where it comes from. So overall, the education fund is not affected.
Okay. Committee?
Madam Chair, am I on your visible?
Yeah, Senator McDonald, I see you now.
The this year, this upcoming year is will be based on the student count from last fall. Is that correct? I'm asking the witness.
Yeah, so sorry.
Okay, so but is it not true that last fall would be a notoriously fickle count, with some schools meeting in person, others with students withdrawn, others meeting online? So is this an attempt to eliminate the problems of a fickle count by putting this percentage in here?
Well, last year you passed legislation, I think to hold harmless at 5% for that 1 year, because you were concerned about students switching from public schools to being homeschooled. So you put some protection in over the last year that was only for a year, and this provision here would be going forward, ongoing.
So for the upcoming year, is this number, does it deal with I don't want to say that the student counts for last fall were arbitrary, but they were just unprecedented in how they were equalized or perhaps computed. Is this designed to solve that problem?
I'm sorry, Senator McDonald, I'm not sure if I'm following your question.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I think Senator McDonald, no, this is not related to that provision. There was a hold harmless put in place that was addressing the fact that the pupil count was screwed up in those years, to use a technical term, because of the number of kids that were homeschooling and that kind of thing. So districts were just protected from that. This only affects, again, it's only a small number of districts, the ones that were forced to merge by the board. So everybody else is already subject to this.
Thank you very much, Mark. And Madam Chair, I'm pleased to hear that. If there are complications with the student count for last year as a result of the individual school districts' reactions to COVID, and that they need to be resolved or have been resolved, I would hope that we are reassured that problem is solved. So thank you.
Technically, if this is not impacting the ed fund, it's not in our jurisdiction.
Well, it does affect the tax rates for individual districts. It just doesn't affect the bottom line on the education fund, because we raise the same amount of money regardless of where we get it from.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator Hardy.
Thank you. A comment on that. I mean, this would mean that the other districts outside the individual district for whom this benefits would have a lower tax rate, and it would be spread out over the other districts that around the state. So everybody else's tax rates could potentially increase a slight bit. I mean,
Yeah, very, very
It's
slight though.
very slightly. It's a tiny little amount, but that's basically how it works. But Mark, I just wanted, or Jim, whichever, you say it's just specifically for the districts who are forced to merge, and I'm looking at Title 16, Chapter 133, and I don't see that provision. There is a repealed F in there already, but there's not specifically language that says that. What am I missing?
Well, you're not missing anything, Sarah Hardy. This language here would extend the benefit that the voluntarily merged districts have by session law, but it applies to all districts. This F applies to all districts, but in fact, a number of districts, because they voluntarily merged, already have this benefit.
Oh, it's in session law, so that's why I'm not seeing it in the statutes.
Well, yeah, it was taken care of for those voluntary mergers in session law.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
So this applies more broadly, but because of that session law provision, that's why you're saying it's specifically only to bring
Correct.
other districts in. Okay, got it. Thank you.
It was one of the incentives to merge.
Right.
There was a whole package of incentives to merge. This was one of them. I think what they're saying is, okay, mergers are done. There's a reason to do this. And if we have a school where a bunch of kids decide to homeschool that's in a district that was forced to merge, this would kind of protect that district from sticker shock. So
Madam
any
Chair,
other questions? Senator Pearson?
thank you. I want to chase Senator McDonald's question a little bit because there's a timing issue that I'd like to at least understand. In September 2020, we kind of, I believe we just said, we're going to assume that your enrollment is the equivalent of a year prior, given the pandemic. Is that, first of all, is that accurate?
I think that was accurate. I think I said a different thing a minute ago. I think I'm wrong. I said 5% hold harmless. There are various versions of that were drafted last session. I think the one that was passed though was, as you say, it won't be lower than your count last year.
Okay, so that's the count, but here we're referencing actual numbers. So I would guess that in September 21, most enrollment of actual numbers will be a little bit higher because presumably some people, were homeschooled or whatever during the depths of the pandemic. So I guess I'm just trying to make sure we understand how those two bits of language interplay, if there is any interplay that we should be aware of.
The way I see it, and maybe Mark can confirm this or whatever, the thing you did last year lasted for 1 year as described, to have the number held to no less than the previous year. But going into next year, if you pass this, then it'll be looking at the actual number of equalized pupils in the previous year. So it's not going to be taking the adjusted number from that you have from this year because of what you did to give a hold harmless. It's going to take the actual number. So I think they're quite separate. Like you have a 1 year benefit on one method, and you have a new method and benefit going forward. I don't think they separate quite well here. But Mark, can you help me with that?
No, I think that's basically right. I think districts are protected against the loss of students attributable to homeschooling as a result of the pandemic. So I think that issue was taken care of. And this is prospective. It's going forward. Equalized pupil counts based on two-year average ADM. Anyway, so you're always got that moving forward. So I don't think the two provisions conflict in any way or cause any issues.
And
Thank you.
Senator Pearson, I'll just add that I believe the hold harmless that we put into place last year was actually on average daily membership, not on equalized pupil. And the ADM count is taken every October 1st. And then equalized pupils are calculated based on the ADM count. So this is a hold harmless for equalized pupils, which are the weighted membership for each school district. And our hold harmless was on actual, like essentially bodies of kids. And that sounds bad, but like the numbers of actual kids in a school district that we held harmless out of this sort of concern that kids were going to be staying home. So I think that Mark and Jim are right that they interact slightly, but this is a sort of prospective moving forward, and that was just for a 1-year thing.
Okay. Any other questions, discussion? Okay, Jim, you've got another one, right? The small
Yep.
schools grants?
And the story here is much like the story we just discussed. So I think you're all familiar with small school grants.
Other
Just to frame this for a moment, the in Act 46 and the merger legislation you passed, there was a benefit given to voluntary mergers that basically turned the small school grant into a merger support grant. So it go on forever. Different name, but same thing, goes on forever. This extends that benefit to any school that received a small school grant in fiscal year 2020 would get that same grant going forward. So just like for the voluntary mergers, now this extends to districts that did not merge and districts that were forced to merge. They're all getting the same deal. And that's what F1 does. F2 is just kind of mechanics. So this would go on forever, except if you close the school, cease operations, then it stops. You can't double dip. So if you get a benefit, so if a district that voluntarily merged already has this, it can get it again under this legislation.
Okay. This was another of the incentives to incent schools to merge. But one of the purposes of the school merger was eventually to have small, non-financially viable schools merge because they were not financially viable. And that decision was left up to the new merged school district. If we put this money back in, are we defeating the goals of Act 46? Are we incenting the maintenance of smaller districts? And is that what we wanted? I mean, this is the education committee. What was their rationale on this one?
Well, I don't recall this being discussed in Senate Education. This came out of, well, I'm not sure actually. I don't recall this discussion happening in Senate Education, put it that way. It may have, I'm not always there, so it may have happened. But to answer your question about the effect of it, it would be giving some further funding to school districts with a small school. So to extent that acts as some kind of incentive, or I'm not sure, but it does benefit. It does give a benefit that's not there and now necessarily for these school districts that have a small school. I think, though, I asked Mark this before this, and he can speak for himself, but the effect, I think, is very minimal on this one in terms of the impact, financial impact.
Okay. So if it was discussed, so this came over from Ways and Means? with these two provisions on it. So maybe we need to get the reporter from Ways and Means to talk to us.
Representative.
Mark, do you have anything to add on this one?
I don't think so. It just, again, it has a very, very small impact on the education fund because you're basically converting an existing small school grant to a merger support grant. About half of the districts would benefit a little bit from it, and about half of the ones that are eligible would lose under it. The reason that they're in favor of it is that, again, as Jim pointed out, it becomes a permanent part of their aid. And the small school grant is something that you have to qualify for annually. It can go up and down. So it provides a little bit more stability for them. But your earlier point, is well taken. This is a benefit that was initially extended only to districts that voluntarily merged. And this is extending that benefit to those districts that did not voluntarily merge. And I think that's a theme in both of these provisions.
Okay. But they are now merged, most of them. There's a few that didn't have to merge.
Right. I guess the argument is that they didn't voluntarily merge, but they are all merged now. And so shouldn't they be treated the same way across the board, even though they got there in a different route?
Okay. Committee, any questions, thoughts?
Can I just ask a clarifying question? So
Ask
Mark,
any question.
okay, thanks. Mark, this is, again, is there a session law that makes this for, like in the other provision, that makes this eligible for the districts that voluntarily merged? And now this is just saying those that were forced to merge, because there's not language in here specifically that says.
Yeah, I don't know. Jim may be a better.
That's one for me, I think. Yes. So there's session law that in Act 46, for example, that gave this benefit to districts that voluntarily merged.
Okay.
So this is extending that same benefit again to districts that did not merge at all and districts that merged involuntarily.
Okay.
It's all in session law, though.
That's the session law for the ones that voluntarily merged, yes. This brings it into statute for all school districts.
Still law. All right, committee, any other questions, discussion? Okay. I can't see all of you, but I'm not hearing any. So I think that's it. Thank you, Jim. If anybody comes up with any questions, let me know. I told the chair of Ways and Means my intention was to put the yield bill on miscellaneous tax because that's where it traditionally has been. It came out as an independent bill just so schools knew in January that we weren't looking at the same tax rate that was projected in November just because of the new revenue forecast that came in January, which was a whole lot better than previous revenue forecasts just because of the timing of how those work. So thank you. There is some concern on Ways and Means about the fact that the teachers' health care was moved over. They thought they had a $13 million bottom line, and I had to tell them we think it's down to 3. But I'm not sure if that'll get anything sent back to us. And that was an action of the Appropriations Committee. They moved it out of the big bill and into ed. And they did fess up. So I don't know what's going to happen with that one, but we did pick up somewhere around $43 million in pension costs in the ed fund. And when all this surplus money goes away, plus we've kicked the $8 million for free food, free breakfast down the road a year. When times go back to normal, it could get a little painful in there. So just be aware of that as we go forward. we can always try and kick the some of the $43 million back to general fund, but considering that they just put 250 million into pensions, they might not be too receptive. So just a cautionary tale. Okay, we're going on to 360.
Wait, can I ask one quick question, of Mark, before he leaves? Mark, did you do a fiscal note or any like table of districts that are impacted by these two provisions or anything, just for my own?
Yeah, we have a fiscal note that I can send to you.
That would be
It
great.
provides a little bit more detail. It doesn't break out district by district, but I can get that for you if you're interested.
Yeah, I mean, even just a list. I'm just curious because I love this stuff. So thanks, Mark.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, before you go, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so yesterday, we got discussions on net neutrality, and I think that has gone in as a priority, but not a requirement. But then there was open access. And reading the House language, open access sounds like it might be being focused on community broadband, some of the PEG discussions. And Christine, we remember you saying that depends on what you mean by open access. And we understand that you don't want to have to string lines and then let your competitor hop onto your lines and undercut everybody else. But just help us understand, is this something we should talk about? Is this dangerous? I mean, from your perspective, and is Irv, I'm not seeing Irv here yet.
Yeah, Irv just entered the waiting room.
Okay, yep, there, I say it's not like Irv to not be here. Welcome, Irv.
I am sorry I'm late.
No, we are very early. We didn't think we'd get through 10 bills on the floor as quickly as we did. We
Didn't think you
passed
would either.
over more than one. We'll be there a long time tomorrow. But we're talking about open access. It sounds really good and something we should do, but I think we realize it depends on how we define it.
Mhm.
Or maybe it's not something that the CUDs can deal with at all. So I was gonna let Christine talk and then I give you a chance to chime in and we'll
Yep.
see what to do.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I just have a short little presentation. You know, open access is like, it's like talking about the weather. Everybody has their opinion on it. So it's good to start with a standard definition. And if you can share the screen with me, I will go ahead and pull up this presentation. Let me see. Okay, I've got it. So can you all see that? Okay. So anyway, again, I'm Christine Hulkwitz. I'm the administrator for both NEK Community Broadband and Lamoille FiberNet, and both are committed to open access. But let's start talking about what the definition is. And this gets to what you're talking about, Senator Cummings. You know, the idea that we're trying to serve areas in northern Vermont that typically, you know, start with 6.5 houses or businesses per mile, you know, 6.5 customers per mile. So you really don't have a business case, you know, and just a quick little story, you know, in 2011, I was asked to help Johnson get a grocery store after their store got flooded twice that year. And I went around and met with a bunch of folks. And then we did a business profile study, and we realized Johnson, Vermont can't support 2 grocery stores. So even though I had 2 grocery stores that are interested in coming in, of course, we only put one in because what you don't want to do is put both grocery stores out of business. And it's the same thing here. When you get into the low density areas, you know, first of all, I doubt anybody's going to compete for the areas, you know, that are in the densities we're looking at. But secondly, you don't want to set up a business case where both fail. So I'm going to take this definition that came from the Institute of Local Self-Reliance, that it's an arrangement. One network is open to independent service providers to offer all services. And in many cases, the network owner only sells wholesale access to the service providers. So basically, you got one owner of the network who's going to provide the services and ensure the services are provided, I should say, rather than say provide those services, which is along the lines of what I think the legislature was thinking when we set this CUDs up. But I want to start first by ensuring you all understand that only a CUD can offer open access. And I'll get to this. It really gets down to the FCC law, 1996 telecommunications rule. While rural network plans may only support one end provider, as I talked about, the CUD as the owner can ensure that the reliability, the customer service, and the responsiveness and all those specifications are met, and that the end customer design choices tie in with what's important for the state as a whole and what's important for the long term. And if a partner does not, even though you may only have one provider on your network at a time, if they don't perform, the CUD is able to pull other providers in, even while that other provider is sitting on the network, so that nobody loses any performance. And open access includes design and considerations for all, including public safety. But 100% coverage cannot be mandated with private providers. And I'll provide that detail on the last slide. But just to give you a visual, what we're looking at typically is 144 strands, and a tube of fiber is 12 strands. So you would basically reserve, the CUD in designing the network. And when we're doing our business plans, this is what we do. We dedicate a tube for ISP1, a tube for ISP2. Well, if you're only going to have one provider, why would you have two tubes? Well, you have two tubes set aside with fiber so that if one provider is failing or the prices get too high, that you as a CUD can bring another provider and basically take over. Also, you commit a tube for public safety.
For those of us that don't eat and drink this every day, an ISP could be Comcast?
ISP, yes, and that's important to note. When we talk about Waitsville Telecom and the other local providers and Kingdom Fiber and others, that's what the ISP would be. It would be Comcast or Waitsfield Telecom or any other local provider. So yes, that's exactly who it would be. And we would be committing a tube for public safety, the electrical grid in terms of smart grid and climate change solutions, and then keep a tube for others. We're going to do that. The independent ISP providers that incumbents today aren't going to do this. But let's talk about the 1996 Telecom Act, which I'm going to read this out to you, even though I typically don't like to read slides, but I'm going to do that anyway, because it's important to take time to understand the language of the Telecom Act. In the 1996 Telecom Act, Congress made a distinction between two types of services: telecommunications service and information services. When you think of telecommunications service, it was a traditional phone service, and we were all used to the idea that there was a requirement to serve. There was universal service for traditional phone service. It was part of the common carrier rules. However, fiber and broadband information services were not covered under that. And based on the definitions of the 1996 Telecom Act, the FCC classified fiber and broadband as an information service, and as a result is not treated as a common carrier service and is largely exempt from regulation. So the point is, we through our public policy can't enforce universal service with a private provider, but the CUDs can do that through their negotiated agreements. And you can, because we're a municipal, require us to do that. So I'm going to tell you the only way we're going to get universal service and or open access is via the CUD. But there's a difference between serving an area, rural Vermont, versus serving Burlington, for example. Burlington, with its approximately 100 customers per mile, can afford several different carriers competing, because you really need about 20 customers per mile to make a business case today. But when you're down to 6 or 7 customers per mile, like we're looking at rural Vermont, you just can't afford to have 2 providers in there, but you can afford to have universal service, and you can afford to have, you can afford to have the CUDs mandate and require as part of those contractual agreements, which you can't do with the private providers. So that's kind of a summary. I'm sure you have lots of questions, so.
Yeah. When you're talking about universals, I think we understand that, yeah, 6 people per mile, you can't be running Comcast and Consolidated and, 3 other ISP providers on your line because there's just too many people to pay the costs. But who's bearing that cost? Is that the cost? Comcast has the provider, right? If they're the ISP provider, who are they getting paid directly? Is the CUD getting a fee out of this?
Yes, what the ISP will do is provide a leasing fee for the network. So and we're right now putting out a pretty, an 88-page request for partnership that really looks at the entire network. The CUD could own the entire network right to the premise, the fiber to the premise. And then the Comcast could come in and pay a leasing fee, basically a monthly fee for using that network, and then sell their services. And they can still make tremendous profits because their profits are going to come from increasing their level of service. So.
Okay. So you're going to get a leasing fee, but if there's only 6 people per mile, it wouldn't be worth leasing it.
Well,
Especially not
that's
if
where
you were going to allow 2 or 3 ISP providers to compete. Is that?
Yeah, you could barely afford to have one. The only way, and we're doing an extensive business plan, and we're looking at the entire 57 towns in the greater NEK network. I can tell you that without grant funding, you can't get to every.
I think we've gotten that message a long time ago.
But with the grant funding, we can get to every address, every single address we can get to. And we're going to do that. And we're going to make a business case that works for our ISP partners. If we didn't have the grant funding, we would not be able to make that business case. But our business case becomes much better because we don't have the overheads, the profit and the investor overheads that we have to pay for. So we can lease our network at a very low or a much lower cost to the Comcast of the world because we have less cost. Okay. So that it continues with that end ISP business model, but it just makes it possible to get universal access.
Okay, but when you say universal access, because I think we may be mixing that. Part of universal access, I think we see as going past every house. So every house, if they want it, has access to the line. But then there's universal access to the line. And what I think I hear you're saying is that means you've got 1 or 2 or 3 or how many ISP providers. Probably in most CUD cases, it's going to be 1 because there aren't enough people to make a good business case. Then, but you're also in there, and this gets to some of the issues with the PEGs. You will have one for community activity, community TV, so social, one for, I'm forgetting the picture here, but public safety, which I assume means that might get tied in somehow with the FirstNet system or could work for E911. And then one down there for telecommunications.
Yep, and one for the electric utilities so that they can.
That's right, for the electric utilities and the smart grid.
Yep.
Okay. And that's another definition of universal access. You will let all of them on. Now, we talk about the other thing we wanted to do was net neutrality. Will you let all of them on for the same price? Will you?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
That, again, that ties to the way rural electrification occurred. You didn't charge somebody up in Canaan, Vermont, more than you charge someone in Heinsberg.
okay,
That's the idea. So we're building our business case as the entire network, but we're also looking at town by town. But we're actually, when you get down to the address, we are going to serve every address. That is probably the most important element of universal access. We will serve every address. And we're going to do that by partnering with these other ISPs.
okay. I saw Senator Bray, then Senator Pearson, then Senator McDonald. I think in that order. I know I saw Pearson first. He's got his nice yellow hand up.
Okay, thank you. My actual pink hand was getting tired or obnoxious, so I thought I should put it down and put up the yellow hand.
My white hand comes to rest on you that you have a problem if I leave my cursor there too long.
I just wanted to get some terminology straight and ask a couple of questions. So the step one, you're putting fiber, you're running along the roads, running to houses. Is that the model, or is it always fiber to the premises for each CUD, or is it fiber past all the premises for each CUD, and the road to house link becomes someone else's responsibility, that last piece?
Well, the typical relationship there is, what I'm familiar with is typically an ISP will provide the first 400 or 500 feet for free to connect to a house. So if you're out like at my house on the reservoir, 7/10 of a mile, I'm going to have to put some of my own money in to get to that connection. But that's really part of kind of the fairness.
Okay. And so when you first put this up and there's nothing going on yet, is this, sometimes we talk about dark fiber, is that it's in place, but it's not performing any service yet? Is the right way to refer to it?
Well, the dark fiber, so hang on, let me stop my phone here. So for the provision of service to the addresses as an ISP, that will be what's called lit fiber. So the fiber that goes by will be lit, and then you can tap into it. And it follows the same idea of electricity, right? You've got electric wire running by your road. There's electricity running through it that you can use.
Okay.
Dark fiber means we're not using it yet. So for example, public safety right now, we would commit a tube for public safety for future public safety requirements and working with the state in order to get maybe universal cellular access and universal 911 address wherever you are. That's going to have to be a longer part of the plan. But when you light that, you're going to light that according to the specifications of that's required by the public safety network.
Okay. And so and when you say tube, which I haven't heard people saying before today, is that actually referred to a single fiber or a group of 12 fibers? What's a tube?
A tube is a group of 12 fibers. Okay. Typically, you could do single fibers to ISP providers, but most providers would prefer having a tube because a tube is basically 12 fibers encased in a shell. Yep. That way you have a surety that you're going to be in control of your own network. The problem when you're doing single by fiber, sometimes if a provider is not careful, they can mix colors and kind of screw things up. But as a good CUD, we would also have good color maps for our individual fibers as well.
Okay. You don't want to send any electricity out of the water tap. I got it. All right. So, and then when you have all this lit fiber, whether it's to the home or not, when you say network, is that yet a network? May have no traffic on it, may have no one delivering any service, but I mean, you said, well, we'll put up a network. So I'm just trying to, what level of things are happening by the time you call it a network?
Well, a network is actually and I use these terms loosely, so because others can have different interpretation. But, I come from the electric utility business, and I think that, the fiber networks consider the same thing. You're building all of the infrastructure to get it done. That becomes your network. Whether you light it or not is not, doesn't change it. You either have a lit network or a dark network.
Okay.
Just let me-
And I promise I'm getting almost to the end of these. When you talk about ISP, so internet service providers, in the world we're talking about growing in Vermont, are the CUDs, is it going to be a mixture of CUDs acting as ISPs, or is there a preference to turn that over to someone else? So you're leasing a tube to someone else who's then going to use that tube to act as an ISP.
Yeah, there's not universal agreement with the CUDs on this. If you look at EC Fiber, they have a Valley Net that I'm not sure whether EC Fiber operates the network, but they've split that up similar to what a CUD would do. And that really depends whether there's an operator or a sublease. If we have an operator for the entire district, then it's then the operator would take care of everything, including maintaining the network, and just lease the network from us. So that can change from CUD from contract to contract.
Okay, and then now I'm really to the well, I think I'm at the last one. Senator Pearson brought out the worrisome specter of CUD built out, and then another service comes along, they buy a tube, and they start providing, that CUD is acting as an ISP. A big carrier comes along with deep pockets, and it does a loss leader program for 3 years and pulls over, gets people to basically switch from the ISP that built the whole thing to now the new competitor that comes in. Is that a concern that you have? And
yes, in fact, it's such a concern both for Lamoille FiberNet and NEK Broadband. We actually put in our request for partnerships that cannot happen. In other words, you can't give special rates and then change that later on. So,
okay.
So it's
so I'll ask a silly question in a way, but is that legal to tell someone what rates they can do?
Well, it's okay for a CUD to do that. You as a government entity couldn't do that, but we can, because we're developing a contractual relationship. So we're looking at getting 6 or 7 providers try to compete for our network, and we're putting these restrictions in place up front. Now, if we don't get anybody to respond, we know we're going to have to loosen some of those restrictions. But we know that some have already responded to similar restrictions. So we're starting with what works best in terms of getting universal access.
Okay. Well, then another restriction, sorry, it goes hand in hand with this one, was net neutrality. So that anyone who's going to lease a tube, could you impose upon them a contractual relation that says you can't, you must be net neutral? You can't throttle back service on programming that's not provided by, channel X.
Yes, in fact, that is actually part of our RFPs as well, where you basically are buying bandwidth, and what the user does with that bandwidth, it doesn't matter. So if you're buying, 100 megabits up and down, you as a user can do anything you want with that, and you're not going to get charged differently. And that would be required under the contract, of course, net neutrality. We are requiring it under the contract.
Okay, so if I'm the wonderful world of nature, and I want my show always to be privileged, it might operate at 100. I can't say that another another vendor, another programmer who has a comparable sort of programming is going to get reduced speed so that it's going to be kind of a hassle to watch their wonderful world of nature as opposed to mine, and I'm providing it.
That's right. We're not going to allow anything like that. That's net neutrality is part of the contract.
Okay,
All right, but
thank you.
again, going back to your having a competitor come in, if I'm signing a contract with you to provide a nature channel, can I have a non-competition, like you're only going to rent to one nature channel?
No, we're
Okay.
agnostic to whoever.
Okay.
Yep, whatever the service is.
Okay.
Yep.
What does lit mean, Madam Chair?
Okay.
If
What
if
does
the
what
network
mean?
is lit,
They turn the fiber on.
Yeah,
is
lit
that what it
means
means?
lit means it's energized. It means there's
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got Senator Pearson next.
Thank you. This is very helpful. I hope we can pull back to our mission here, though, because we're not talking about these things in theory. What we're needing to decide is, are some of these principles conditions to take a grant? You know, I think we have all become schooled in the fact we have very little power over these companies that provide internet. We have significant power because we're giving away tens of millions of dollars. So I want to ask you, Christine, because you're really good at helping us understand this. Your picture of what goes on your fiber, that you know, that as I think of it, that's a community-minded broadband network design. But I'm curious, you know, but then how do we split it so that we say, you know, you must help public safety. We would love you to, you must help the utility, but we don't want to undermine your ISP side of the business or your contracts with ISPs. And should all of this be wrapped up in a grant requirement? So can you help me think through that? You've sort of set the table, but now when we think about how should we and how would we describe some of those elements as a grant requirement? Does that make sense?
There's a requirement, and then we're talking about priorities. It might not be a requirement, but some things would push your grant to the top of the list.
We've lost Christine in a startling hiccup.
Christine is frozen in time.
Just when we need
Maybe we'll go over
right.
to Irv, and Christine, I'm sure, will be back. Irv, can you enlighten us?
Thank you. I also have a very brief presentation. And I wonder if
Christine is back, so maybe we'll finish Christine,
right,
and then you're
fine.
May I
okay.
ask my question, Madam Chair?
Yeah, let me ask my question, Senator.
Yeah, let's get through that one, and then we'll get to yours.
Okay.
I think they're related. Okay.
All right. So let me make it clear that you will not be able to do that with private ISP providers, put those grant restrictions in place, because you can't regulate them, but you can do that with the CUDs.
Well, hold on. Let me understand this, because the prospect we're looking at here is any case CUD, you want this grant, here are the conditions. One of them is you must ensure to the extent you can that it's net neutral, that it's 100-100, blah, blah, blah. So in there, because we're a granting entity, these are voluntary. Nobody has to take the grant. So doesn't that give us some ability to then influence the kind of ISP contracts you could have?
Yeah, you could do that with us, but you wouldn't be able to do that with a private provider because you can regulate us as a municipal, but you can't do that with a private ISP provider. And you only have to look back the history of Vermont to see that, with grants that have been taken where they haven't met their requirements, nothing has happened. I don't want to call out any names here, but I'm sure you can all, think about who I might be speaking about.
Well, those
I
were issued through the feds, but so you're saying even if we write the conditions in, it's voluntary to take a grant, we're pretty limited in what we can enforce, you're saying?
With the private providers, but with the CUDs, you can enforce.
Okay,
Why
when we
wouldn't
say private providers, because I don't think we're thinking of having some of your legacy ISPs in general, come in. The bill as we have it says perhaps they could do it in partnership with a CUD. The one thing that's out there is the independent telecoms.
Well, the CUDs will work with the Waitsfield telecoms, but the independent telecoms, that's you're talking about a different business than traditional telecom. You still don't have the same enforcement power because, again, referring to that last slide, the 1996 Telecom Act refers to information providers, which are the fiber and cable providers, the bandwidth providers, treats them differently than a telecom provider. So even if they're a private telecom company, you still don't have the enforcement capability.
Well, we could claw back the grant, no?
Well, that you'd have a hard time doing that and having stand up in a court of law, from my opinion, because once the network's been built, where you can only force them into bankruptcy. I'm just telling you that just avoid that issue altogether by having the grants go through the CUDs.
Madam Chair, I think Christine's missing Senator Pearson's question, if I may. Christine, I think what Senator Pearson's asking, if we impose those conditions on a CUD contract, can the CUDs, to the extent they subcontract with an ISP, can they insist upon those same conditions with the ISP?
Yes, they can. That's my point. That's the point I'm trying to make as well. The CUDs, as part of the contractual agreement, can do that. But as a government entity, you are not able, as a legislature, you can't, but we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
But because the proposal that's out there is that independent telecoms could apply for grants under the same conditions as a CUD. And you're saying we can't do that because they are different.
Yeah, yes, that's right. If you make that, you don't have the control if you make it available to the independent ISPs. You basically lost control. So you can't meet that objective.
Okay, and you're saying that Waitsfield, Champlain Telecom, Franklin Telephone, they are all independent ISPs.
That's correct.
So we cannot regulate them. They
Yeah.
are regulated, the telephone companies are regulated utilities. All right. Answers one question. Senator Pearson, you look.
Well, I really just don't understand how we don't have that power in a grant. This is a voluntary thing. You want a grant, you sign a contract. Why can't we stipulate, just as Christine is doing with their ISP provider, they don't have the right to regulate net neutrality any more than we do, but they're putting it in a grant in their contract for the provider. I don't understand why Waitsfield Telecom doesn't have to sign our contract with our stipulations of what is involved. Otherwise, don't take the grant. We don't care.
Yeah,
If
you won't be able
want
to
the grant.
You won't be able to enforce it. That's the point. They might agree to it, but you won't be able to enforce it. You've already seen in the history of
But
Vermont
then they're in
Telecom.
breach of contract. How are they not in breach of contract? They repay our grant. Oh.
Maybe what we need to
good-
do is get somebody from the PUC or an attorney that specializes in this to talk to us. And that, I think, is part of what we asked Josh Diamond to look into for us.
Madam Chair, I'll turn it over because others are being patient, but there is language on page 16 of the bill that I'd love us to understand from our witnesses today, whether or not that is workable and accomplishes some of what we've been talking about.
Okay, so we'll give them a chance. Senator McDonald, I had you next for a question.
Yes, Madam Chair. In listening to Christine's presentation, I think the starting point was the definition of service when versus information. And if this CUD owns the fiber that travels through the CUD area, the CUD's expenses are paying off the debt for the fiber and paying the rental that may be due for the space on the poles, be it GMP, be it a Muni electric company, be it WEC or Vermont Electric. If the CUD owns that fiber, free and clear, because the grant has paid all the costs, then the CUD's expenses would be only the expense of maintaining and paying its share of the maintenance on the pole. Is that correct, Christine?
Yeah, it's operations and maintenance, including keeping the network going, the backup power for the hubs and any of the rental space for the hubs. So there's a lot of costs involved with that. But yes, the operation, we would keep the network lit.
Okay. So if grants cover putting the fiber out into the countryside, and the CUDs basically have no or little cost because their grant has picked up the majority of the work, the CUDs would be free to lease fiber to a variety of enterprises who wish to provide information, and charge them basically what the CUD needs to charge them to pay off its maintenance costs and its past debts. And it can do that from any of a variety of people who wish to sell information on the CUD's fiber. Is that correct?
Yeah, but this isn't possible with the kind of money we're talking about here. We're talking about, you're talking about the grant money that we're looking at for the NEK network. We're looking at about $140 million network. So if we get a $40 million infusion with grants, we're going to use that to leverage another 16 million in loans, and then we're going to go to the bond market 3 years later. If the state was going to grant, the total cost for the entire fiber network, that would be true. But we're still going to have costs associated because we know we're not going to get totally grant funded.
We're going to go to the bond market unless we find a whole lot more money.
Yeah, that's right.
So my question is that if the CUDs are able to build in places that would not have a business case, and we've all agreed they don't have a business case, but they are paid for by grants, and by charging entities like Comcast or Fairpoint or others to sell a product on their fiber, they can accept all proposals that pay off their rent and their maintenance and whatever. But is that basically correct?
Yeah, if we own
Okay.
the network, we can put the requirements on those people that use our
Okay.
network.
But
I will point out that there's a certain point, and I believe that number is about 3 paying customers a mile or below, where even if the network was free, that still wouldn't support the operations and maintenance costs of the network. So you get to a certain point where you're gonna lose money on your last customers, but you're gonna make up for that by the higher paying customers.
So Madam Chair, thank you for helping me to understand that. the question we might ask Christine is, if that's what CUDs can do with grants, and if they can service most of their customers, and maybe they'll do some by fixed cell, but we won't talk about that. How could the Waitsfields of the world position themselves to is there any way they could have a similar arrangement in their contracts to have fiber built to them?
They can't get universal access. We have an advantage of significantly lower cost because we're not paying shareholders, and we're not paying a margin for the venture, for the money that gets funded. So, that'll work as long as we build the network at a low cost, and then we can lease it to them as operators.
Okay. So, thank you, Madam Chair. I think what Senator Pearson was getting at, if we can build fiber out into the countryside, and the CUDs were the ones that went out and spoke to the customers to urge them to get hooked up, and can accept a variety of people selling information on their fiber at the same, competitive rates. We have a plan to get to the unserved. So
I think the argument I heard from the telecoms is they are already the provider of last resort with landline. So they have lines, they're required to have phone lines going up those roads.
for dial tone, yep.
Yeah, for telephone. I think the question that Christine has raised is, can we as a government say, if you come in and apply for a grant and you say, yep, we'll do all this net neutrality kind of thing, and access, and then they go back and they don't do it. Do we have any ability to enforce that, because legally we can't regulate them? And I think that's the one we're going to have to get
Some contract law answers.
his lawyer to
You
answer.
have to ask some people that understand contract law in this context. Yes.
Got it. And utilities and everything else. So we will see what we can find. Senator Brock, did you have a question, comment?
Yes, it also goes back to Senator Pearson's questions and comments beforehand regarding contractual arrangements. And I think what Christine is saying is basically only a CUD can do this, because the CUD as a municipality is the owner of the network, and nobody can compel the owner of the network to do anything. But at the same time, as I look at Waitsfield Telephone and Franklin Telephone and others, I'm just astounded that if there's a contractual arrangement in which the state has given money to that organization, and part of the contract of receiving that money from the state is that they provide open access on that network, I would find it incredible that that's unenforceable, because we are not ordering them to do anything. Now, that said, the issue of enforceability includes what's in the contract, because there are always remedies in a contract, or otherwise there could even be something as direct as liquidated damages in the event that they breach it. But I do think that the right answer is, let's bring in legal counsel and have them give us a briefing and a finding as to whether or not there's anything in federal preemption that would prevent that kind of contract. And I find it hard to believe that there is.
Yeah, I should also tell you, if the money goes to those telcos, there's going to be no incentives to work with the CUDs. So but that said, I do encourage you.
Are you meaning just the Waitsfield and the Franklin, or are you thinking more broadly?
Well, I'm thinking at Waitsfield, Franklin, and others. Why would they work with the CUDs? We're just, they've got the money, they can move on. And again, I'll remind you that none of this has been enforceable yet. And I do encourage you to understand the 1996 telecom bill. I think that's a great idea. But I'm just saying that, you've got the opportunity, and you as a legislature designed these CUDs. I thought they were a pretty marvelous idea, but I don't know why you would back off from that at this point.
Well, I'm looking particularly at CUDs and the number of CUDs that we have, and I'm thinking about those parts of the state in which CUDs are not particularly active because the legacy providers have the lion's share. I'm looking at the number of unaddressed locations that CUDs would be taken care of under this legislation, and there may be 60,000 at best locations, at least that we're targeting, of addresses that are unserved or underserved. But there are 278,000 other addresses that are being served by other providers. Now, the question is, as you build out, I'm assuming that you would pick up some of those customers. How many remain to be seen, but to the extent that based on what we have on the agenda right now, I'm hard pressed to see the CUDs going into relatively populous areas of Chittenden County, even though there are locations there that do not get broadband effectively. That isn't part of your business model, is it?
It is part of our business model. In fact, if you look, we're passing, and I showed this in the last presentation. I showed a slide that showed that we just about every area town we go into, we have to pass overserved locations to get to the unserved. But as we pass by them, we are going to offer service, but we're not intentionally going into those areas. We're only going through those areas to access the unserved areas, the unserved portions that just aren't profitable for them to serve. So that situation already exists. You can't avoid it.
But, is it your intent, for example, to go through Chittenden County as a CUD in areas that are heavily served, but that do have some unserved locations?
Well, I'm not responsible for Chittenden County, but certainly we've looked at Newport. For example, the city of Newport, the city of St. Johnsbury, the well-served, there's plans to serve them with fiber. We have to go through those areas anyway to access, areas like Troy and Newport town that are underserved today. So we have to go through those areas. So, and I suppose there are cases where Northwest will have to go through parts of Chittenden County. You just can't avoid it when you're designing a network.
But when you're designing a network with the concept of open access that we've been talking about, as you go through an area that is served by anybody, would it be your intention to offer fiber to whoever wants to rent it from you that either may be the same carrier or a competitive carrier to those that are already there?
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah.
Would you, in terms of any agreement that you have with people who rent fiber from you, allow them to impose limitations on other fiber being provided to their competitors?
We would make sure, by definition of open access, we're going to provide that access to other providers. We're also going to put requirements on that contract in terms of how people get served. And we can do that as owners of the network.
Sure. Okay. So that's your intent. That's good. Okay. Thank you.
I want to give Irv a chance. I didn't think this was going to get this complicated because I wanted to talk about governance, which is the one big section we're out of. So Irv, I think we're going to go to you and we will see if we can rustle up a telecommunications lawyer to, I know maybe Maria is the one. We may need to find someone at the PUC or the department, but some expertise because we're getting down into the weeds on contracts. So, Irv.
Thank you. I also have a very small set of slides. If it's feasible to share my screen.
Yeah.
Except that I think I hit full screen too soon. Okay. What do I need to do? Share screen. Okay. And that is going to be this. Okay. Do you see it now?
Maria says she can give us a legal opinion, so we will get her on at some point.
Okay. I have a point of view that in many ways overlaps and agrees with Christine's, and in other ways is complementary and somewhat
We
different.
are not seeing a screen share.
You are not, right?
I don't know, has Faith made you a co-host?
Yes.
Okay, Faith is up. There it comes.
There
All
we go.
right.
Okay, all right.
You got it.
As I was saying, my points of view in some ways match Christine's and in some place differ. With respect to the very last topic of getting to the outskirts, I like to say that in order to get to the outskirts, you have to pass through the inskirts. It's just a basic reality. Okay, that's an irrelevancy. We see two basic models for open access. One is dark fiber paths. That is, that we've got a piece of fiber up on the poles. We aren't providing electronics at either end of that fiber strand. The lessee provides its own. And the network owner maintains the physical cable, and as Senator McDonald points out, pays the pole rental and so on. There are ongoing costs, even if all the debt service has been paid off, because you have to have some provision for repairs if a tree falls on the line. Our alternative, which we think is more practical, is service delivery through lit infrastructure. And again, lit means that we've got optoelectronics that we take responsibility for at each end of the fiber. At the hub, the central facility from which the cables radiate out, and at each customer's home that convert the signal from light pulses back to electrical pulses. We reserve system capacity for third parties. In the case of a third party, the trouble reports on whatever service that third party is providing go to that third-party provider. Now, this model is particularly appropriate if you think of services that aren't the internet itself, but are services provided over the internet, such as, frankly, telephone. About 60% of EC Fiber's customers take a telephone service that we arrange for, and the charges for that are on their monthly bill. A few arrange for alternate phone services. A burglar alarm company. The electric company might be using our existing infrastructure, both for meter reading and to control load in the home. Those are examples. But in EC Fiber's case, we are our own ISP. Under the hood, it's ValleyNet operating those services for us, but customers are getting bills from EC Fiber and paying them to EC Fiber for their internet service. We are certainly open access in the sense that any party is free to market services through our internet connection. In either case, the wholesale price is set for the third party to cover a proportionate fraction of the debt service and so on. In low density areas, I would agree completely with Christine that there's a question about how much market there is to support competing ISPs. As for the risk of loss leader pricing and of business customers being cherry picked, as I point out, those issues don't arise for specialized services being delivered through publicly owned internet service. The specter of a large competitor, say Comcast, leasing access through our network, charging low prices until we go bankrupt, and then picking us up a facility at pennies on the dollar. Actually, the bond covenants do not give the bondholders recourse to seize the physical network. They give the bondholders the ability to require us to increase our rates so as to meet our costs. So that is another kind of protection that's there. I wanted also very briefly to comment on a couple of other definitions. Universal coverage. I want to emphasize CUDs go to all the premises on the electric distribution grid, wherever the pole lines will take us. If somebody has chosen to build and live off the electrical grid, we don't believe that scarce resources should be used to build a line of poles out to their house to deliver a service that they apparently have opted out of. So we would like to see that clarified a little bit in legislation. It's a footnote issue, but it's an important one. And the last point I wanted to bring up, based on having listened to your discussions yesterday, has to do with business plans. Business plans have to evolve. It is appropriate to ask a CUD that is planning a phased, staged process of building its entire territory and starting with a unit which it believes will become economically sustainable in a relatively short period of time so it can take it to the bond market. It's reasonable to ask for a credible business plan for that first phase. But I think if you do stipulate business plans in your legislation, that you should include the term first phase, because, as I say, business plans have to adapt to conditions as conditions evolve. I know you didn't ask me that question, but I'm taking the opportunity to put that comment in. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions. I think that it's quite clear that, as I said, that Christine's point of view and mine are complementary. They overlap in some ways and differ in others.
Okay, committee. And Irv, maybe if you can take that down.
Yeah. As soon as I find out how here. Meeting controls. There it is. Stop share. There.
There we are.
Thank you.
Okay, Senator Brock has a question.
Just a
Oh,
question.
and Senator Bray. All right, Senator Brock first, and Senator Bray.
Just to follow up on your comment regarding the grid a couple seconds ago, although this is a little bit off target, do you believe that we should also be exploring whether or not the entire issue of connectivity via fiber should be left to the electric utilities to do rather than individual CUDs?
On the one hand, first, I hadn't thought of that question. As I consider it, I cannot imagine a CUD with enough excess funding to be able to contemplate that greater breadth as a practical matter. In terms of the universal coverage question, again, a small number of people don't want to be part of the rest of the world. And I don't think they have an obligation to go running out to them and saying, oh, please, 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 let us give you this access that you don't want. Mm-hmm. But you could leave that to the CUDs. On the other hand, I don't think it's inappropriate to specify that universal means throughout. You could say the pole grid, utility pole grid, rather than the electric grid, because there are pole lines that were put up by telephone companies rather than the electric companies. But I think it is an issue of following existing utility pole lines rather than spending money to build additional new ones.
Well, in a way, that's probably the crux of my question. And I've raised it here in the committee before. And that is, we have a grid. We have poles. Yep. And we have lines to every house in Vermont that has electricity that's on the grid.
Right.
And now, as we talk about, again, ubiquitous universal broadband, we're talking about individual CUDs who then create their own companies or subcontractors to extend fiber on those very same poles. And so when we have a windstorm and a tree falls on those lines, we send 2 trucks out. And the question is, shouldn't we perhaps also recognizing where the expertise is in stringing fiber and in connecting it already lies? Are we, with the model that we're talking about, are we potentially doing this twice in a more expensive manner?
Respectfully, sir, Senator, I do not think so. The skills involved in stringing electric high voltage wires, relatively high voltage. I mean, it's 440 volts at the top of the poles. Sorry, Christine, I may have got the number wrong, but that requires equipment and training and highly paid crews who, on the other hand, do not have the skills involved in stringing optical fiber and splicing those tiny strands end to end. Typically, when an electric company undertakes to string fiber, they will not use their electric line crews to do that. They will engage with a subcontractor that is a specialist in fiber optics, such as, for example, Eustace.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, Senator Bray, and then Senator Pearson.
Thanks, Mr. Tomei. I wanted to follow up on a couple details. So on the universal service side, we've talked a little bit about this in terms of a requirement. I think from a previous conversation we had, one of the notes I still have is that it's by a date certain, because build out won't be instantaneous, and it'd be helpful to have not just a commitment to universal service, but a universal service by a date certain, so that we don't end up with a less meaningful agreement than we thought. Is that still your thinking?
It is. That the CUD would enter, a CUD would have to have a plan, or a private entity would have to have a plan. If it's going to cover territory, it can't be some vague, well, someday we'll get to it. It is not reasonable to expect them to give you a fully detailed plan for the entire territory at once. It is reasonable for them to lay out phases, stages at which they intend to undertake to get the job done that clearly lead to a well-defined endpoint. And of course, you can call for checkpoints along the way.
Okay. Thanks. Another thing that has been of interest, maybe more to me than the committee generally, but the engineering standards. And as a shared engineering standard, so that we know that interoperability will be achievable over time, which would help with possible mergers or acquisitions or whatever downstream. So is you volunteered, thank you, to look into whether or not there is a recognized engineering standard to ensure reliability and interoperability. Can you offer an update on that one?
Well, there are multiple possible standards. The Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, known as the IEEE, that's the overall standards body for all manners of electronic engineering. They have standards. There are more specific standards in the broadband industry. I'm not in a position to recommend, and I don't think legislation should stipulate a particular standard by name and number. But interconnection from one optical fiber that's at the boundary of one CUD to another optical fiber that's reached the boundary from the other side from another CUD is a very straightforward matter if they are both passive optical networks, which is the model that is used by or being planned by all the CUDs I'm aware of. The exception to that is VTEL's active network that Mr. Guite told you about. I want to mention about that, by the way, to our minds at EC Fiber, the more important distinction between his network design and most is that it's a home run network. That is, there's a single fiber running from the hub all the way unbroken to each individual customer. That is much more expensive to build, more complicated to maintain when a tree goes down, and On the other hand, it is more open to true open access. I mean, it's much easier to let a third party come in and lease the fiber that runs from the hub to Joe Schmo's house. But it has a lot of disadvantages, and it is probably not readily interoperable with most other fiber optic networks. And I would also point out that coaxial cable networks, the kind that the big cable companies routinely build through neighborhoods, are not fiber optic and don't readily connect. I've heard Senator Cummings comment a couple of times. We know we can't connect from the end of the coax cable to fiber. You could interconnect from the end of the cable of the fiber cables that CCI is building to further optical fiber going out beyond their borders. And in my previous testimony, I have suggested that if there's any way you can lean on CCI to put their money where their mouth is. I didn't say that before. Maybe I shouldn't say it now, but will they incorporate in the cables that they're stringing through downtown Montpelier? Will they incorporate an extra tube of fiber running to the edge so that CVI fiber doesn't have to start at the center of town, can pick up from the edge and go on into those outskirts that CCI doesn't find profitable?
Okay. And I think you went back and forth between active networks and passive. So is the general design, other than the one proposal we heard of, everyone's using passive optic networks? That's the most common.
Yes, passive optic network design is much more common. A few fibers going out from the hub are performing what's called transport functions. Each of them is carrying a very complicated optical signal to an optical device partway out there in the hinterlands called a splitter. And at that splitter, that single beam is divided 16 or 32 or even more ways, and then feeds the individual fibers that are going to individual customers' homes. There's no need for electrical support at that splitter. That's why it's called passive. It's just an optical prism, basically. It's doing that.
Thank you.
And I should say the speed of that network doesn't depend on the splitter because it's handling light beams. The speed of the network depends on the optoelectronics at the two ends of the fiber.
I guess I'd ask one very quick last follow-up on that, just to make sure. I think the impression was given to us by one party that talked about active optical networks that we were buying last century's technology and we might want to think about the next century's technology. So can you address that? Are we making a wise investment that's going to be durable, in your opinion, by sticking with passive?
Absolutely. The current development in the industry is toward what's called, the current standard is called GPON, which is short for Gigabit Passive Optical Network. The current trend in the industry is 10 GPON, which means 10 gigabit passive optical networks. The distinction, again, is in the electronic devices at the two ends of the fiber. A network that wants to upgrade to that much higher bandwidth changes out the devices at the ends of the fibers at the customer's homes and in the hubs. It doesn't have to redo the fiber.
Great. Thanks for your help.
Thank you.
Senator Pearson.
So really quickly, H360 at the top of page 16, which is where the House has talked about funding priorities, says number 7, include public broadband assets that can be shared by multiple service providers and that can support a variety of public purposes. To Irv and Christine, is that adequate to address what we've been talking about? Does that cover it? Is it, should we offer more protection, or have they nailed this fairly complicated conversation, in your opinion?
That's for
Well,
universal access.
First, Christine, if you'd like to go first, you're welcome to.
Okay, I do think that covers it. You know, that is certainly the intent of the two CUDs that I'm working with. Yeah, so I would just leave that language as it is because I think it's pretty clean.
I think it's adequate. Frankly, I'm a little bit disturbed by can be shared by multiple service providers, but not very disturbed because, as I said, there are specialized services: telephone, burglar alarm, meter reading, and I think that both any of the types of networks that I'm aware of being planned by any of the CUDs or that is currently being operated by EC Fiber meet this requirement.
Thank you.
Thank Christine and Irv for coming back and enlightening us.
Thank you.
I
for
hope
asking us.
it's still a lot to absorb. I'm going to give us about, let's come back at 4. Give us a little more than a 15-minute break. We sat on the floor for a while. We've been here for a while. And we're going to have a discussion about governance. We've gotten that far on the decision points. I think that's the last big decision point, and then we can start fine tuning our understanding of universal access and what's a requirement and what's just a preferred condition. Trying to make sure we get what we want, but we don't hamstring the CUDs who may come in different shapes and sizes as they develop. So when we take 15 minutes,